Welcome back to the workshop. Today I'll be walking you through how you can make a fast and accurate longbow with simple tools and common dimensional lumber you can find at a hardware store like Home Depot or Lowe's. In this video we'll be covering everything you need to know to make a bow like this. How to choose your wood, design your bow, bend it, and keep it from breaking. Everything from string making to finish and leatherwork. Music for today's video comes from my talented cousin, the guitarist Marcos Topolansky Quintero. You can listen to this entire album on Spotify or download it on iTunes. Chapter 1. Wood Selection. I'm using sugar maple, but oaks, hickory, and many other woods work just as well. You'll find a link in the description to a list of reputable bow woods, or you can ask me in the comments. When you're choosing a board, you want to find one with straight fibers that go all the way through the board, with minimal runoff to the sides. Most boards won't make the cut, so expect to look through plenty. A 1x2 board 8 feet long works perfectly for this design. The actual dimensions are 3/4 of an inch by 1.5 inches. I used a total of 80 inches of 1x2, 72 inches for the bow, and 8 inches for the handle riser. I didn't find a good 1x2, so I got the nicest 1x3 and ripped down the sides. When you're out choosing a board, keep an eye out for runoff. This is when the fibers run at an angle to the board. In general, you want to look out for any signs that fibers have been cut prematurely, like feathering growth rings, island or cathedral patterns, and runoff. These can sometimes be okay on the belly or the sides of the bow, but you don't want them on the tension facing back. Also look out for standard defects like knots, wiggles, and warp. The way the end grain looks isn't as important as the faces of the board. You can use flat sawn or quarter sawn lumber, or anything in between. The growth ring angle pretty much doesn't matter, unless you plan to chase a growth ring. If you don't know what any of that means, don't worry about it. What really matters is the fibers. You want a board with straight and uninterrupted fibers all the way through its length. This is especially important for the back, which is under tension. You want the back of the bow to have a clean strip of fibers all the way through, without any serious interruptions. If you have to make a tiebreaker between two boards, then it's worth looking at the end grain. A good board will have a minimal amount of porous growth, resulting in more wood and less air. For the same reason, you should avoid low-density woods like pine and poplar, unless you lower the draw weight or make your bow extra wide. These woods have less wood in the wood, so you need to compensate with a wider bow or a lower, less stressful draw weight. Chapter 2. Design and Layout. Today I'll be making a 40-pound bow that can comfortably draw 28 to 30 inches. There's a good amount of wiggle room with this design, so you can go a bit shorter or a bit higher in draw weight if you'd like. You'll just have less room to make mistakes. If you want a different draw weight without changing the design, then just make your bow proportionally wider or narrower. I recommend 68 to 72 inches in total length, but as low as 66 inches or even less can still work just fine. As you shorten the design, you reduce the total energy storage, and also your margin for error. I'm making this bow fairly long for maximum margin for error. Longer limbs can tolerate more mistakes and still perform well. But shorter limbs have the advantage of being less massive, so as always there's a Goldilocks sweet spot. Back to the board. Choose the more flawless side of the board for the back of the bow, and cut the board to 72 inches long. For the handle riser I cut out an 8-inch long piece from the same board. I'll be laying out a 4-inch handle with 2-inch fades on both sides. First mark the center of the board, 36 inches from either end. The next step depends on the layout you choose. For a symmetric bow, mark 2 inches above the center and 2 inches below. For an asymmetric bow, mark 1 inch above center and 3 inches below. This is your handle area. Whether you make a symmetric or asymmetric bow is completely up to you. Today I'm going for the asymmetric layout since I like the look and feel. Most people seem to have an easier time tillering symmetric bows, so if this is your first bow, that's probably what I'd recommend. Good bowyers do it either way, and it's largely a personal preference. Chapter 3. The handle and fades. We haven't completely finished talking about the layout. We'll get to the tips later on. If you'd like to see the layout drawings all in one place, I'll put a link down in the description. Next up are the fades. I'm marking them out with a pencil. The fades are the transition between the stiff handle and the bending limbs. Nice smooth fades are very aesthetically pleasing, but they do also serve an important function, while withstanding an immense amount of pressure. You need to make your fades carefully so that your handle doesn't pop off when you're shooting. Today I'm making 2-inch long fades, to either side of the handle. Later on we'll carve the fades to be slightly longer than 2 inches. That way all of the bending from the limbs stays away from the glue line in the handle, which is not designed to bend. Imagine rolling a ball down the fades and the limbs. The path should be smooth with no abrupt angles, and the path should be downhill the whole entire way. For this design, the limbs should never get thicker as you go from the handle towards the tips. Before we move on to the next part, I'll be gluing on the handle riser. Just to reiterate, this is an 8-inch long piece from the same board. Chapter 4. Tools. Soon we'll be continuing with the layout of the tips, and actually start carving away wood. But before that we should talk about tools. You need a tool that removes a lot of wood, and one that removes just a little bit. You can follow almost all this whole build along with just a rasp and a scraper. There's always a way to improvise, so use the tools you have, or the tools you like. You don't have to use the ones I do. I like to do most of my carving with draw knives, but they can be risky on boards. If you want to avoid mistakes, then sticking to a rasp is much safer. The full beginner kit I'd recommend is sandpaper, a heavy rasp, a file, a scraper, and a thin needle file or a chainsaw file. Some other tools I like to use but you don't need are spoke shaves, draw knives, carving axes, and assorted needle files. There are all sorts of tools that you don't need but just make your life a little bit easier. If you don't have any particular one of these tools, that's totally okay. There's always another way. Before we move on, let me just show you how I put a burr on a scraper. Card scrapers are just about the simplest tool, but it's the one I use the most. All they are is a piece of tool grade steel. And if you don't have one, you can make a great scraper out of an old plane blade or an old knife blade. Any piece of hard tool steel will do. To start off, you want a 90-degree edge on your scraper. If it's a new scraper, you're good to go, but if you're resharpening an old one, you'll want to get rid of the old burr with a file or some sandpaper. To form the burr itself, I use a burnishing tool, which is just a rod of extra hard tool steel. It's easy to find a replacement if you don't have one of these. You can just use the base of a chisel or any other piece of hard steel. I'm starting off by rubbing the burnisher at about a 90-degree angle, until the edge of the scraper starts to look smooth and polished, and then we can start to apply more pressure. Eventually the edge will begin to mushroom over. As that happens, you can start to change the angle of the burnisher, to draw out the sharp burr from the mushroomed edge. Once you're done, work the opposite edge and then flip your card over, and work the two edges on the other side. That's 4 usable edges, just from one tool. Chapter 5. The Rough Out. The goal of this stage is to make an oversized bow-shaped object that's still stiff along the whole bending limb. I'm laying out the tips to be a 1/2 inch wide. To start off, I'm tapering the ends of the bow down to that 1/2 inch of width, starting around 10 inches from the tips. This will leave a slight corner that we can round over later on for a smoother and more aerodynamic shape. Especially at this stage, it really doesn't matter how you want to remove wood. I'm using a rasp just to show you how that goes. It takes a little longer, takes a little more elbow grease compared to the draw knife, but it's a lot safer. You're not going to mess up with one of these. Another good method would be to saw out the tips. I'm using a farrier's rasp. They're nice and heavy. Another popular choice is a Shinto rasp, which I'm using to round out this corner. A spoke shave is another great tool to get rid of that corner, and to finalize the front profile of the board. Now that we've roughly established the front profile of the bow, we can start to establish the thickness taper. To spread out the bend throughout the bow, we need to taper the limbs. I've marked the tip of the bow at 3/8 of an inch thick, and drawn a line all the way to the end of the fades. So now we have a lot of wood to remove, but we can't afford a big mistake. So there's a simple trick to organize all the carving and make it go by faster with more control. The idea is to break up carving tasks into facets. Carving on flat wood is tedious and effortful, and your tools will bottom out, but carving ridges is easy. If you break up the carving tasks into triangular shapes, you can carve on ridges most of the time and have more control for less effort. First, remove either corner, all the way down to the guidelines on the side, until you have a nice ridge all the way down the middle. Now you can remove that with ease. I haven't touched the handle yet since we glued on that riser, so now I'm going to carve out the fades. Today I'm sawing them out with a coping saw. Usually I use draw knives, files, and gouges. Use whatever you're comfortable with. It doesn't matter as long as you don't accidentally create a weak spot where the limb starts. The base of the limb should be the thickest part of the whole limb. For now, I'm blending the fades right into the base of the limb. Later on, I'll carve them slightly longer, beyond the dotted line in the drawing. It's important that your fades are strong enough that all of the bending stays away from that glue joint in the handle. Now I'm starting to mark out and shape the front view of the handle. Make sure that whenever you narrow a part of the handle that it also gets thicker. If you narrow the handle but don't thicken it enough, then you'll get a weak spot. It's the job of the fades to get thicker as the handle narrows. That way each portion of the handle remains strong. Chapter 6. The optional backing. First things first, you don't need a backing. If you choose a good board and design and tiller it well, the only backing you need is air. Personally, I prefer making unbacked bows, but many of you will choose to add a backing, so I might as well show you how I would do it. I'll be using some thick linen cloth, soaked in water and applied with wood glue. You can also use just about any other cloth, old pants and jeans, even an old t-shirt, bed sheets, or a dress tie. Thin rawhide strips also make for a great backing, but once again, my personal favorite is to use no backing at all. Notice, by the way, that as I'm applying the backing, I'm inducing some reflex in the back of the bow. That way, once the backing dries, it will be nice and taut, and have a bit of pretension on it. If you glue the backing while the bow is flat, it may come out slightly slack. Since I'm not adding any heat to the bow, it won't retain the reflex. I'm only doing this to keep the backing nice and tight. I can't talk about backings without mentioning that I think you should stay away from fiberglass drywall tape. It's a popular choice, but gimmicky. And it kinda works, but it often also causes more issues than it prevents because of how stiff it is. Air really is the best backing in my opinion, because the way to keep your bow from breaking is with good design, tiller, and wood selection, not a backing. So that's the disclaimer. You will often hear that a backing will make your bow safe and keep it from breaking, and that's not exactly true. It's just a bit of extra margin for error. The real way to achieve a safe bow is to design and tiller it well. We've already talked about how to design your bow for high margin for error by keeping it long and maximizing the bending limb. Soon we'll cover how to keep your bow safe from the tiller side of things. How to make sure your bow is bending well, both for safety and performance. Chapter 7. The Tiller. Most of the manufacturing time for self-bows is devoted to getting the bend just right, the process of tillering. I like to subdivide this further into 3 stages: floor tillering, longstring tillering, and shortstring tillering. The whole central idea in tillering is to identify which areas of the bow are bending and which ones are stiff. Then you want to leave the bending areas alone and carve away the stiff areas until they bend. The other main idea is that you never want to pull your bow harder than the intended draw weight of the bow. Since I'm making a 40-pound bow, I should never push or pull harder than 40 pounds. That will just unnecessarily stress out the wood. One more thing to remember is that every time you remove some wood, you need to exercise the limbs before you'll be able to see the differences to the tiller. It just takes a little bit for the tiller to catch up to all the adjustments you make. Here are some common tillering issues you're likely to encounter. I've walked a lot of new bowyers through designs like this one, and these are the ones I see the most. The first one is stiff outers. This is the most common issue I've seen. It's characterized by too much bending from the inner limbs, and it occurs if you don't taper your limbs enough. Correct this issue by scraping wood from the mid and outer limbs. In bad cases, you'll have to go back to the rough out stage to correct the thickness taper. Number 2. Whip tiller. This is the opposite of stiff outers. A whip-tillered bow has outer limbs that bend too much. Correct this issue by working the inner and mid limbs. A whip-tillered bow can be very sweet shooting in a mild case, and isn't as harmful if you shoot light arrows. But in general, this tiller shape will cost you some efficiency. Number 3. Hinges. If you remove too much wood from any particular spot, it will bend too much and might start to hinge on you. If you let a hinge develop too far, your bow will break or at least take a lot of set. If you catch a hinge early, save the bow by removing wood everywhere else. If you encounter this issue, it also might be a good idea to drop the target draw weight. Problem number 4. Set. You know when you pull a rubber band too far, and it starts to sag and won't snap back all the way to the original shape? The same thing happens to bows, and we call it set. A little bit is natural, but if your bow takes on too much set, it will start to noticeably follow the string, and will lose a bit of potency. Set happens when you overstress the wood. It can be a sign that your wood is too moist, but typically it stems from a design or tiller issue. Unfortunately, the best way to deal with set is prevention. Your best recourse is to design the bow wider and/or longer next time, to make sure you have properly dry wood, or to do a better job with the tiller. I'll talk a lot more about set in the chapter on set, string follow, and heat treating. Alright, so let's recap the tillering basics so far. Try to always pull with about the force of your target draw weight, unless you see one of the issues we just talked about. Always remove wood from the stiff parts of the limb and leave the bending areas alone. Every time you remove some wood, the bow will pull a little bit further. When you hit your target draw length at the target draw weight, then you're all done. Alright, let's get back to tillering. I'm starting with floor tillering. All I'm doing is pressing on the bow with roughly about my target draw weight of 40 pounds, while I watch the limbs bend in a mirror. Floor tillering is a lot faster and less work than longstring tillering, but it's easier to make a mistake. Floor tillering isn't exactly for everyone. If you're worried you'll mess it up and you're more comfortable longstring tillering, it's fine if you do that instead. So now I'll show you how to rig up a tiller tree so that you can longstring tiller from a safe distance. This design also doubles as a portable tiller tree that you can either use on the ground or clamped upright like a normal tree. You absolutely don't have to make a tiller tree. You can tiller with a mirror or just with your body. There is also a popular device called a tillering stick. If you want to make one, there are plenty of guides out there. Personally, I recommend making a rope and pulley style tree like this instead. They're a lot safer and less stressful on the bow. As I said before, you also don't need a tiller tree device and can do all of this manually. I did mortise in the bow pivot for extra strength, but you don't need to. Also, a clothesline pulley is surprisingly strong and can even handle war bows. They all have different mounting methods though, so you'll need to think of your own way to rig up the pulley you have to the tree. The last thing is a note about draw length. The draw length numbers on my tiller tree assume that the handle is 1.75 inches thick, which is somewhat standard. Since individual bows may have differently sized handles, the numbers may be shifted off slightly for a bow that has a different handle size. Alright, we're almost ready to longstring tiller. We just need a string, so let me show you a quick way to make one. Chapter 8. The String. Here's one way to make a single loop Flemish twist string. There are more proper ways, this is just good enough for what we're doing. I'm making a 12-strand string out of B50 Dacron. There are better string materials out there. I just like Dacron for the convenience. It makes for a nice string thickness without needing any extra padding. You can get a roll of string material from most archery suppliers for cheaper than the cost of buying a finished string. To start off, I'm going to make a bundle of strings 100 inches long. As a very crude rule of thumb, for this type of string you want to start with bundles about the length of your bow plus 28 inches. Now I'll separate the two halves into 6-strand bundles, and I'll also trim the ends of the bundle so they're all at a slightly different length. That way when the string tapers out, you won't get a sudden bulge from all of the tag ends coming out of the exact same spot. Okay, now we're ready to start reverse twisting the string. If you've never made cordage before, the basic idea is to twist each individual bundle in one direction, and then counter twist the two bundles in the opposite direction. To make the plated loop, I'm starting 8 to 10 inches from the ends of the bundles, and I'm reverse twisting until I have enough cordage to fold back on itself and make a loop. Once you're happy with the size of the loop, fold the bundles over, fuse the bundles, a little wax helps, and then continue with the reverse twisting all the way down the string. Make sure you keep the twist as tight as you can manage while the bundles are still fusing together. Once you get past that first foot or so, after you're past all of the loose ends, then you don't have to tighten quite as much. With pristine modern string materials, you don't actually have to tightly twist all the way down the length of the string. If anything, over-twisting can make the string stretchy, so for the center portion, I'm doing a much looser reverse twist. Once I get close to the end, then I go back to making the twist much tighter. Alright, that's about it for now. To simplify things, I won't be stretching the string out. I'll just let it stretch out on the bow. If you want to follow best practices, I'll put some string stretching guides in the description of the video. Since this is an adjustable string, it's not a huge deal if it does stretch. You can just retie the timber hitch. For now we're done with the string, but when the bow is done I'll be trimming it to size and serving it for extra protection. So let's skip ahead to the future and I'll show you some clips of me doing that. You don't strictly have to serve the string, it just makes the string last a lot longer, especially where you're knocking the arrow to it. You can get one of these cheap string serving tools for about 8 to 10 bucks. Once again, it's not something that's strictly necessary. You can do this by hand too, the tool just makes your work a little bit neater. You see I have the string stretched out on a string jig, but you don't need one, you can just do all of this right on the bow. Okay, the string is all done. All we need now is a way to attach the string to the bow. Nocks. Now before we go to the chapter on Nocks, let me just show you a quick way to attach your string to your Nocks. This is a timber hitch which lets you adjust the length of the string. Chapter 9. Nocks. It helps to draw your nocks before you carve them. I use the loop in the string as a template. I like to carve the top nocks slightly further from the tip, It gives you a bit more of a nub to hold onto when you're stringing. You don't have to do this, and if you're making a symmetric bow, then I wouldn't. Anyway, I'm going to be making self-nocks on this bow, meaning that there's no overlay at the tips. Overlays can look really nice and allow for lighter, narrower tips, but a lot of the time they're an unnecessary complication. Self-nocks can look just as nice, and they're plenty sturdy. If you'd like to add overlays to your bow, I've linked some examples in the description. I like to use this rat tail needle rasp, and then I follow up with a finer needle cut file. Chainsaw files are easier to find and more affordable, but they work just as well for carving the groove. If you don't have any thin files, you can use a knife or a half-round file instead. In that case, it's easier to make pin nocks or diamond nocks instead of carving a thin groove. Make sure that you test the string loop on the nocks and get rid of any corners where the string could snag as you draw the bow, keeping in mind that the string moves as you draw it. Smooth the grooves so that they disappear into the belly, and then make sure that the string draws nice and clean. Chapter 10. Longstring Tillering. Up to now, we've just roughly floor tillered. I also like to do a lot of this early stage tillering in a vise, or you can just pull your bow manually, ideally in front of a mirror or a camera. So, what tiller shape do you want? You would think it would be a circle, but that's rarely the case. The profiles of the bow influence the ideal tiller shape. In other words, there's not a universal, perfect shape that applies to every bow. For this design and straight stave bows in general, a perfectly tillered bow will have limbs that bend in an elliptical shape. Sometimes that's a circle, sometimes a more eccentric, stretched out ellipse. Which ellipse is exactly right for your bow is a bit of a judgment call. And also keep in mind that if you're using a natural stave, the tiller shape of the bow should reflect the shape of the stave. Okay, before we go back to tillering, I'm just going to touch up the fades a little bit. This will slightly lengthen the fades, and it will ensure that the bending stays away from that glue line in the handle. Now we don't want to take off so much wood that the inner limb gets thinner than the rest of the limb. The inner limb needs to be the thickest part, and the thickness should decrease smoothly, all the way from the fades to the tips. Make sure that you have a good thickness taper before you tiller. If any spots get thicker as you go from the handle to the tip, address those now before you move on. You really want to have a nice thickness taper before you tiller. Every bow is a little different to tiller. Here's the play-by-play for this one. To simplify, I'll be keeping the top limb always on the right side. Starting off, I'm seeing too much bend on the right limb in the inner third. Otherwise, both limbs are stiff in the mids and the outers. Okay, so I'll scrape some wood everywhere stiff. Let's say 20 scrapes a side. Or a few grams of wood. A little more during early tillering, and a little less in the final stages. when you only want to remove a little bit of wood at a time. Let's look at that tiller again. Slightly better, still too much bend from the inner third on the top limb. Outer limbs are stiff on both sides. So let's really tackle that top side, mid, and outer limb. Okay, now the top limb's looking better. The mid limb really started coming around. But the outers are still stiff on both sides. So how can you decide which areas are stiff so you know where to remove wood? There are 5 methods that I use. The first is obvious, it's the shape of the tiller and how the bow moves on the tiller tree. This is the most widely used input on where to remove wood next, but it's also fallible. That's where these other methods come in really handy. The number 2 method to get an opinion on your tiller is to check the thickness taper. You can sight down the limb to get a visual sense of the taper, but there's nothing like using your fingers. You'll be able to feel things that you can't see. When both methods agree on where to remove wood, you can be much more confident about where to scrape. Method number 3, set. Once again, I'll gloss over this for now because set is so important that it's getting its own chapter. For now, any areas that permanently retain the bend are overstressed and are extra likely to correspond to areas that bend too much on the tiller tree, or seem to get thin too fast in terms of the thickness taper. Number 4, look at the wobble on the tiller tree. If your bow has a stiff limb, it may rock to that side while you're drawing it on the tree. Some bowyers like to clamp the bow to the tree or use a wide flat bow mount, but that interferes with this method. So now we have 4 good methods that you can use to cross-check where you should remove wood. Try to listen to all of them, they all have good advice for you. Finally, there is one more option that you shouldn't overlook, and that's to ask the community for input. If you need to borrow more experienced eyes, the bowyer community is incredibly friendly and willing to help. In the final chapter on tiller, I'll be going over how to post a tiller check on online forums. If you want my help in particular, post on the Reddit forum r/bowyer, and I'll drop in when I can. Chapter 11, Shortstring Tillering. It's time to brace the bow. There are many ways to brace a bow, including the step-through method, push-pull method, or using a stringer. If you're not familiar with how to string a bow, I'll put some more links in the description. Some bowyers like to go straight to a full brace. Personally, I like to work up to it, and I start with a shallow brace. I think it helps to keep set down. It's a personal preference. At this stage, I'm also pressing down on the string to stretch it out. Normally, that's not something you would have to do if you properly stretch your string in advance. So, when should you brace? There's a lot of wiggle room and personal preference in the answer. The short answer is anywhere from 12 to 24 inches of draw on the long string. That's a huge window. Some brace sooner, this makes it easier to monitor the tiller shape. Some brace later, which makes it easier to monitor set. Personally, I'm a late bracer. If your string is too loose, it will fool you into thinking that you're further along than you really are. The other thing you need to consider before bracing the bow is whether the tiller is good enough yet. The further you advance into tillering, the easier it is to fix micro issues, and the harder it gets to fix macro issues. So make sure you address all of the big issues you can before you move on to finer and finer forms of tillering. Okay, let's get back to tillering, and I'll walk you through all the main decisions I made. Every once in a while, I like to double check the tiller by pulling manually. Now I'm seeing a little more bend than I'd like in the lower limb, around the inner third. So that means I may have overcorrected a little bit. So next, I'll work the top limb. Alright, checking again. Things are looking much better, but I'd like the lower limb to start coming around more, especially at the tips. All I'm doing is following the mantra. Carve wood everywhere stiff, and leave alone the areas that bend. Chapter 12, Set. To sum it up quickly, set is basically the same as pulling a rubber band too far, so that it sags and won't snap back to that original shape. An engineer might say that the elastic limit of the material has been exceeded. The same thing happens with bows and leads to the wood fibers on the belly getting crushed at a microscopic scale. The main causes of set that are avoidable are excess moisture in the wood, not enough margin for error in the design, and poor tillering. Set is sort of like a report card on your design in tiller. It's the bow telling you how comfortable it is doing the job you're asking it to do. Set happens. You'll always see a little bit. Bows with a lot of string follow due to set can still shoot very well. They'll just be a bit slower shooting. So don't panic when you see a bit of set, but do pay attention to where exactly it happens. Because this is one of the best ways to know where you should tiller next, and which areas you should leave alone. One more thing. The best time to measure set is right after shooting, because this gives you the best visualization of how stressed the bow is when it's actually being used. Okay, let's get back to the bow. So far we're looking at about a ½ inch of set, nothing to worry about. The best way to avoid set is prevention, by using dry enough wood, by tillering well, and by choosing a design with a high margin for error. There is another way, heat treating. This topic deserves its own chapter, but for this build it's totally optional. I actually recommend that you don't do it, unless you're already pretty comfortable building bows. You can ruin your bow pretty quickly with a bad heat treat. I'm only giving this bow a very light heat treat. The goal is just to prevent more set from developing. There are many ways to heat treat. The default seems to be the heat gun, but I've also used coals, silicone heating strips, and space heating radiators. The idea is to get the belly hot enough that the wood fibers plasticize, and then hold them there until they start to toast. When the belly hardens again, it will slightly condense and increase in density. You don't want to heat treat the back, as this will make it brittle. Heat treating seems to make wood stronger in compression, but can also increase the brittleness of the wood. So the woods that respond best to heat treating seem to tend towards being very tension strong and prone to set. This includes the vast majority of the so-called white woods, especially hickory, maple, ash, elm, hazel, etc. I like to heat treat for about 45 minutes a limb, or up to 2 hours per limb for deeper heat treats. This time I'm going for about 20 minutes a limb since it's just a light treatment. Keep cooking the wood for as long as you can before it starts to toast, and then try to toast the belly as evenly as you can. In this case I barely even toasted the wood, since it was such a light heat treat. Chapter 13. Final Shaping. Compared to some of the other chapters, this one's a lot less important to the function. But if you want a nice looking bow, it's worth spending some extra time on the final shaping. Mostly we'll just be sanding out corners and making sure that all the lines and tapers blend together smoothly and attractively. None of this takes very long, but it'll make your bow a lot more elegant and comfortable. The weight you remove from the Nocks will also increase performance a tiny bit. Not a lot, but everything that's on the Nocks that you don't need is just dead weight. If you want to add tip overlays, now is a good time. For your first bow, I don't think it's necessary or advisable. You don't need an overlay despite any myths that you might have heard about that. Now that we have the bow braced, and we know exactly what length of string we need, I'm going to go ahead and trim the string down to length. And I'm also going to re-taper the ends. You've already seen this footage in the chapter on strings. This is just the order I did it in, chronologically. As I said before, you don't strictly have to serve your string. The serving just helps to make your string last a little bit longer, but you can still get plenty of shots off without the serving. And if you don't have one of these tools, you can do it manually as well. Before you're done, just make sure that you get a nice click between the arrow and the string.
Chapter 14. The Final Tiller. I'm looking for a positive tiller on this bow, meaning that there's slightly more bend in the top limb. And since this is an asymmetric bow, I'm even looking for a little bit extra bend in the top limb. At this point in tillering, I start to lose a little bit of trust in the tiller tree. There will always be very slight variations compared to how I pull the bow by hand. If you don't trust the safety of your bow, it's perfectly fine to do all of your tillering on the tree. I'd just rather go into manual mode for the final stages. I feel it gives me a little bit more control.
So if you're questioning your tiller, or if you just want to make sure everything is going according to plan, here's how to post a tiller check online so that you can get good feedback. Feel free to post as many as you need, especially on r/Bowyer where I moderate. If you want to show someone your tiller, you need a minimum of 3 pictures: the drawn shape, the front profile, and the side profile. If you post all 3 on a bowmaking forum like Primitive Archer, Reddit's r/Bowyer, or any of the Facebook bowmaking groups, then experienced members will be able to give you quality feedback. If you only post the drawn shape, then it will only be possible to comment on obvious issues. You should also include any relevant stats like the length of the bow, the width of the limbs at the widest part, and the current draw length and draw weight of the bow. If you have any target stats, then you should list those too. Chapter 15. Troubleshooting. Here are the 10 most common issues I've seen on builds like this, and how to correct them. Number 1. Too much bend from the inner limb, / not enough thickness taper. If only the inner limbs are bending, then this is a sign that you don't have enough of a thickness taper. Make sure to get a good thickness taper going before you ever start tillering. It's really tempting to keep the tips stiff. It makes them seem sturdy, but actually you want them to feel flexible. Obviously you can make the tips bend too much, leading to whip tiller, but for some reason this is a much less common mistake. Number 2. Not enough bending limb. If you followed the design in this build, then you won't have this issue. When in doubt, double your draw length, and then add a bit extra for non-bending handle and tips. How much extra you add depends on how much extra margin for error you want. In other words, each limb should approximately have as much bending limb as your draw length. Number 3. The handle section wastes too much bending limb. Often this issue comes up when someone tries to copy the design of a fiberglass bow with only wood. If you use a longer handle than I have in this design, don't steal that length from the limbs. They need it more. If you want a longer handle, make a longer bow. Number 4. Not enough margin for error. Performance features are tempting, but it's easy to bite off more than you can chew. Any kind of performance feature needs to be counterbalanced by extra margin for error. If you want recurves, reflex, a higher draw weight, short bending limbs, or a high draw length, then you have to balance that out with any combination of wider limbs, longer limbs, a lower draw weight, or a shorter draw length. If you add performance features without including enough margin for error, then they'll only get in the way of your performance. Number 5. Fades that are too abrupt. We covered this one earlier in Chapter 3. A nice concave curve looks much better and also eases out the stress, making the handle less likely to pop off. Avoid letting your fades bend at an abrupt angle, and make sure to keep all of the bending away from the handle. Number 6. Tips that are too stiff, or overlays that are too big. The whole point of overlays is to make your tips lighter and thinner. If they aren't, then you should just go with self-nocks. Number 7. A long string that's too long. When you're tillering on the long string, shorten the string as much as you can without bracing the bow, especially if you're doing a tiller check. In general, the lower your string hangs, the more it will distort the geometry of the tiller shape. This is something you can correct for, but it takes experience. Keep that string tight, and you'll get a more reliable draw weight reading as well. And then once you brace the bow, the draw weight reading should correspond closely to what you saw with the long string. Number 8. Excessive set and/or compression fractures. A bit of set is always natural, but an excessive amount should make you consider dropping the draw weight. Preventive solutions for next time are to design with more margin for error, or dry your wood better, or do a better job with the tiller. If the bow takes a lot of set in one particular spot, you may see what are called frets, crescelles, or compression fractures. There isn't a good way to fix them, but luckily they aren't always fatal. If you see crescels, keep an eye on them. If they start getting worse, it can be worth retiring the bow, but otherwise they don't necessarily present a serious safety concern. Number 9. Tools get stuck, chatter, or cause tear out. When a scraper chatters, it's giving you a little hint that in that small section, it was working against the grain. Try reversing the tool direction for that small area where the chatter happened, and that may get rid of the issue. With any cutting tool, resist the temptation to follow through with any cut where you see tear out. If tear out happens, stop and back out. Don't try to rip up the shaving by force. Once again, you can usually get around the problem area by changing the cutting direction. For more carving tips like this and a detailed demo of what I mean, check out my video on beginner carving tips. Number 10. Breakage. It happens. Typically, it comes down to a combination of poor wood selection, bad tiller, and not enough margin for error. If it happens, try not to get discouraged and still post some pictures online. You'll get great advice from others who have been there before. You do have to ignore a lot of warning signs before your bow breaks. With a good board, you'll see a lot of set before you get anywhere close to breakage. Now for the fun part, shooting in. All we're doing is shooting the bow, for ideally a couple hundred shots at least. If any of the issues we just talked about come up, especially tillering issues, then consider going back a step or two to troubleshoot and repeat. Chapter 17. Finishing. Sanding, stain, and finish. Finishing will typically make your bow lose a few pounds of draw weight. I started off a couple pounds heavy and finished off just above the target weight. To start off, you want to get rid of any tool marks with your scraper. You can sand them off too, but typically the scraper is faster. After that, I sand the whole bow with 220 grit. I don't like to use anything coarser than that since you'll leave tool marks. After sanding a layer, I wipe down the bow with a wet cloth. It should be dry in a minute or two. If you're in a real hurry, you can use alcohol and it will dry pretty instantly. This step will raise any wood fibers that have been lying flat, and will make sure that they get shaved down clean in the next step. Sometimes I'll give the bow a second pass with 220 grit, if things are still looking at all rough. This time I went straight up to 300. If you're going to stain your bow, don't sand much higher than 400. I like to stop at 300, otherwise the stain will go on in a patchy way. When I don't want to stain a bow, I'll keep sanding with finer and finer grits up to around 1000 grit, using the wet wipe to raise the grain in between each grit. For a very fine buff, it can help to use a sanding sealer before the last couple of passes of sandpaper. I like to use shellac since it's one of my preferred finishes anyway. You don't have to sand anywhere near that finely. Those are just my tips for getting a mirror polish on bare wood. It's not what I'm doing today, but that may be where you want to go with your own bow. Here I'm using leather dye. This is Phoebing's dye. I'm using the colors black as well as saddle tan. I've also used aniline dyes for a nice 3D effect, but my favorite method is to use roots and plants as direct stains. Back to the stain job. I coated the whole bow in saddle tan, and then covered the back in black, and finally I'm blending the tips and handle into black. By the way, I'm using a cotton ball wrapped in gauze, but you can also just use a bit of paper towel or a pom-pom brush if you have one. Alright, after everything is dry, we're ready for finish. I really like shellac, it's my go-to finish. I buy the flakes and mix it myself, it's easier and cheaper that way. Spray shellac is also a great choice since it dries so quickly. I don't recommend buying pre-mixed liquid shellac in cans, because a lot of it is sold expired, and there's not a good way to check. Don't fret about the finish too much, you can also use your preferred polyurethane finish. Most will be more than fine. If you have gunstock finish, those are also some of the best choices. True oil, for example, is a lot of work to put on, but probably the best finish I've used. And of course, you can just use any drying oil, like linseed or tung oil. Personally, I would only use those on an unstained bow, though. Finally, I like to buff the bow with a coat of beeswax. If you do that, just make sure it won't interfere with your finish, in case you ever have to patch the bow. Shellac plays really nicely with wax. Chapter 18. Accents and Leatherwork. I'm just going to show you how I put on a handle. If you want a full-on explanation, I have a detailed video about how I make this style of handle. You can use just about any leather thick enough to stitch. I like using vegetable tan or partially tanned leather, at least a few ounces thick so it's thick enough to tool. Not all leathers will tool well, so you may want to skip that. Keep in mind that you don't need a leather handle at all. You can leave the wood bare, upholster with lace and cloth, or wrap with thread, natural cordage, bark, etc.
Chapter 19. Care and Maintenance. The most important thing is to never pull your bow to a draw length that it wasn't tillered to. If you let someone shoot your bow, just make sure that their draw length isn't longer than how far you tillered the bow to draw. We designed this bow for a very particular draw length, and you don't ever want to pull further than that. If you do want to pull further, you need to design and tiller the bow to be drawn that way. Don't force it. Otherwise, these bows are pretty easy to care for if you take care of them. You can expect to need to refinish it in about a year or so, maybe twice a year if you use it often. The string can need a bit of maintenance too, just a little wax as needed can help keep it from fraying. After a while you might have to replace the serving, but overall these modern material strings last for a very long time. Other than that, try to keep your bow indoors. In general, if you're comfortable in the room, then it will be fine long-term storage for the bow as well. Chapter 20. Special thanks to the awesome Sam Harper and his site Poor Folk Bows for getting me started in archery and inspiring this build-along. The site is no longer up, but you can still find a PDF with all of the content in the link section below. Thanks as well to Tim Baker and all of the bowyers of the Whitewood Wars. Thank you to my cousin Marcos Quintero for all the excellent music. And finally, a big thank you to everyone who peer-reviewed this video. If you catch any mistakes, differ in opinion, or just like to do things differently, please let me know. Okay everyone, I hope you're feeling ready to take on a bow of your own, and knowledgeable enough for the next one too. Whatever happens, post your project online, and send me a link in the comments too so I can check it out. If you enjoyed this video and know someone else who would like the project, please do pass it on, and maybe try it out together. And as always, please keep supporting the craft by subscribing to this channel and any other bow making channels you come across. Alright folks, that's all. Until next time, may your arrows fly true.